wind felt colder as they approached Hollow's End, carrying with it a faint smell of decay, like something long dead. The streetlights buzzed ominously, casting sickly yellow light that barely illuminated the cracked pavement. Even the trees, bare and skeletal, seemed to lean inward as if warning them not to enter. The feeling in the pit of Maya's stomach, though she would never admit it, was tightening, twisting. Emma stopped in her tracks, her breath visible in the suddenly freezing air. Something doesn't feel right. It's too quiet. Tyler, always the joker, tried to brush it off, but his voice was tight. Guys, it's Halloween. It's supposed to be creepy. But this wasn't the fun kind of creepy. No giggling kids in costumes, no distant laughter, just silence. It felt like the whole world had forgotten this part of town. The deeper they ventured into the neighborhood, the stranger it became. Doors seemed to open slightly as they passed, only to slam shut when they looked back. Shadows moved unnaturally, stretching and curling toward them. The houses felt wrong, like they were watching. Ryan glanced over his shoulder for the 5th time, convinced that something had just shifted behind him. "It's like the street is alive," Ryan muttered, his eyes darting nervously. Emma's hand tightened on her candy bag. "Maybe we should go back." But Maya was already leading the charge toward the next house, the one at the very end of the block. Unlike the other houses, this one looked old in a way that felt wrong. The wood looked like it had been charred, the windows grimy and broken. The front door stood slightly ajar, like it was inviting them in. As they stood before it, a sound reached their ears, a faint, rhythmic tapping from inside the house, almost like footsteps. "We can skip this one," Ryan suggested, his voice faltering. But Maya was determined, though the confidence that had carried her up to this point was starting to crack. She knocked on the door, the echo of her knock seeming to linger in the still air longer than it should. They waited, and when the door didn't fully open, Maya pushed it with a creak that sent shivers down everyone's spine. "Maya, come on. This is a bad idea," Emma whispered, eyes wide with fear. The weight in the air seemed to press down on her lungs, making it harder to breathe. Ignoring them, Maya stepped into the house. The door immediately slammed shut behind her, the sound so loud and final that it felt like the world had just swallowed her whole. "Maya!" Ryan yelled, pounding on the door. "Open the door, Maya!" Inside, Maya's heart pounded as she whirled around. "Okay, very funny, guys," she called out, but the room was empty. And then, the smell hit her. It was thick and rancid, like rotting meat. Her stomach turned. "What is that?" Her voice trailed off as something in the corner of the room moved. At first, it looked like a shadow, but it was too solid. It lurched toward her, dragging one leg behind, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowing faintly red from deep within the shadows of its face. "Maya," a voice whispered, but it wasn't hers. It wasn't even human. Her throat constricted as she backed away. "Guys, please, open the door." She tugged at the handle, but it felt as though the door was being held shut from the other side by an invisible force. Panic set in, cold and sharp, freezing her in place. Outside, Ryan kept pounding on the door, while Tyler and Emma stood frozen. The shadows around the house seemed to be alive, swirling and twisting like tendrils. Emma's voice cracked as she whispered, "Do you see that?" Tyler swallowed hard, nodding. We have to get her out of there." Suddenly, the house's windows lit up with a faint, sickly glow. They could hear Maya's voice from inside, but it didn't sound like her anymore. It was distorted, filled with terror. "Help me, please. Don't leave me." Ryan's face paled. "We have to break the door down." Just as he was about to slam into it again, the door creaked open slowly, as if it was waiting for them. Inside stood Maya, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her face was twisted into a crooked, unnatural grin, her eyes dark and hollow. She tilted her head as though she was a puppet, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Trick or treat," she whispered, her voice like nails on glass. The friends froze in horror as Maya's body contorted violently. Something was wrong with her, her limbs stretching and bending at odd angles. The walls around them seemed to warp, the house itself breathing, the wooden floors creaking like bones snapping under pressure. "Maya," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. The creature wearing Maya's skin let out a shriek, and all the lights in the house flickered and died. Ryan grabbed Emma and Tyler, yanking them toward the door, but something seemed to be pulling them back, a force like cold hands gripping their shoulders. They ran, the air growing colder with every step they took, the shadows behind them writhing like they were alive, chasing them. The house's twisted laughter followed them down the street, echoing in their ears long after they had escaped Hollow's End. But when they reached safety, they realized they had left Maya behind. And whatever had taken her was never going to let her go. The laughter from Hollow's End echoed in their minds long after they had escaped its cursed streets. They didn't stop running until they were several blocks away, their legs burning, breath hitching painfully in their chests. The world felt wrong, twisted somehow, like everything familiar had been scraped clean. They collapsed onto the sidewalk, panting, hearts still racing. But one thought cut through the haze of panic. Maya was gone. Tyler was the first to speak, his voice broken and hoarse. "We left her." His words trembled in the cold night air, barely above a whisper, but they hit with the force of a hammer. Emma had her knees pulled to her chest, rocking back and forth. No. This can't be real. This can't be happening. Her voice cracked with disbelief as tears streamed down her face, panic spreading like wildfire. Ryan stared back down the dark street toward Hollow's End, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "We should have, his voice caught in his throat. "We should have done more." Tyler shot to his feet, pacing frantically. "How could we leave her there? We just left her." His voice cracked, anger rising not just at the situation, but at himself. "We didn't have a choice," Emma snapped, her tears spilling over. "That thing wasn't Maya anymore. You saw her, Tyler. We couldn't do anything." But Ryan wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, hollow, as if seeing beyond them, stuck in that twisted house with Maya. His guilt clung to him like a weight, dragging him deeper into his own mind. "I could have saved her," he whispered. The guilt gnawed at all of them, an unshakable shadow that lingered even as the night turned to dawn. The next morning hit like a freight train. The horror of the night before felt distant, almost like a bad dream. But the terror, the dread, the guilt, all of it was real. Ryan hadn't slept. Neither had Emma or Tyler. They had spent the early hours of the morning pacing their homes, unable to shake the gnawing fear in the pit of their stomachs. The kind of fear that made their hearts race with every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind against the windows. When Maya's mother called, everything shattered. Emma was the first to get the call. She stared at her phone, dread building as the name flashed on the screen. She already knew. They all knew. And yet, hearing the broken, desperate voice of Maya's mother asking if she had seen her daughter sent Emma spiraling into a cold sweat. "No, Mrs. Collins," Emma had whispered, her voice barely audible. "I haven't seen her." But that was a lie. A horrible, suffocating lie. Tyler paced back and forth in his room, the memory of Maya's twisted, inhuman grin haunting him every time he closed his eyes. He couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop replaying the scene over and over again in his mind. The way they just left her. His mother knocked on his door, her voice muffled. "Tyler, are you all right?" He wasn't. He wasn't all right. But what could he say? That he had watched his best friend get taken by something. Someone that wasn't human? That they had been too terrified to do anything but run? Ryan, on the other hand, had locked himself in his room. He couldn't face anyone, not his parents, not his friends. He felt like his insides were twisted up, churning with guilt and fear. Maya was gone. She was gone, and he had failed her. He'd heard the way she called out, heard her scream for help, but he'd left her. He hadn't saved her. By mid-afternoon, Hollow's End was buzzing with police cars, and search teams combed through the neighborhood. Maya's parents had reported her missing early that morning when she hadn't come home after trick-or-treating. Emma stood on her front porch, hugging herself tightly. She watched as the officers moved up and down the street, knocking on doors, showing Maya's picture. A deep, nauseating pit of dread sat in her stomach. She knew it was useless. Maya wasn't missing because of something normal, something they could fix. She was gone, swallowed by something none of them understood. Tyler couldn't bring himself to leave his house. He watched from his bedroom window as Maya's mother, disheveled and frantic, spoke to a police officer outside. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her voice hoarse as she explained that Maya had gone trick-or-treating with friends, but never came back. "They'll blame us," Tyler muttered, pacing again. "They'll say it's our fault." Ryan hadn't come out of his room all day. He couldn't. The thought of seeing Maya's parents, of facing that deep, unbearable grief, it was too much. He sat on his bed, staring blankly at the wall, replaying every second of the night before in his head. Every scream, every desperate plea. The house, that house. He could hear Maya's mother's sobs echoing in his mind. He could feel the weight of her loss pressing down on him like a boulder. "We have to tell them," Emma said later that evening when they finally gathered in Ryan's room. She had tears in her eyes, her hands trembling as she spoke. "We have to tell them what happened." Tyler shook his head vehemently. "Tell them what?" "That Maya was taken by a house? That something from a horror movie happened? They won't believe us. They'll think we're crazy. They'll think we abandoned her," Ryan added bitterly. His voice was flat, empty, like all the fight had been drained out of him. We did abandon her. "I don't care what they think," Emma said, her voice cracking. "We owe it to her to tell the truth." But what was the truth? That they had knocked on the wrong door and lost Maya to something they couldn't explain? Something evil? It felt like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Days passed, and the search continued. The police combed through Hollow's End, but they never found Maya. Her face appeared on the news, on posters, but deep down, the remaining 3 friends knew that no search team would ever find her. Not in any way that could be explained. They began to unravel, each in their own way. Emma couldn't stop crying. She barely ate, barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Maya's twisted, smiling face. She felt responsible, like it was her fault for not stopping her from going into that house. She started having nightmares, waking up drenched in sweat, convinced that Maya was still out there, somewhere, calling for help. Tyler withdrew completely. He stopped going to school, stopped hanging out with the others. He was consumed by guilt, by the memory of leaving Maya behind. He started hearing things at night, footsteps outside his window, soft tapping on the walls, whispers in the dark. At first, He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the sounds became more persistent, more real. One night, he heard Maya's voice, soft and pleading. "Why did you leave me?" Ryan was the worst of them all. He couldn't shake the memory of the house, of the way it had seemed alive, watching them. He started becoming obsessed with it, convinced that if they went back, they could save her. He'd sit for hours, staring at maps, planning, but the others refused. They were too scared, too broken. Eventually, Ryan stopped talking about it. He stopped talking altogether. The guilt had hollowed him out, left him with nothing but cold, paralyzing fear. And so they drifted apart, each haunted by the memory of Maya, by the thing they had seen and done on that Halloween night. But no matter how far they tried to run from it, Hollow's End never let them go.